Hello, good evening, and welcome to the TNT Show. I'm John Drummond, and I'm your host for the next 60 minutes. And these are 60 minutes really you don't want to miss. So if you're watching this and you know of somebody else who is interested in media and media relations, get on the phone and give them a call and say, look, you've got to tune into the TNT Show. It's going to be really good tonight. Thanks for joining us on Indie Live. This is our 139th show. Thanks to you, because we are not like the BBC. We don't have £300 million budget. We depend very much on you watching us. And hopefully we can provide a watch over what's happening across Scotland and beyond and share that with you, which is what we're going to do tonight, big time. The Indie Live channel is adding new shows, but it obviously needs your support. So wherever you can see the Crowdfunder or fundraising for Indie Live, maybe see it on the screen shortly, please think about giving us your support. We could appreciate it. As I said, we'll be talking about the media tonight. So I want to share with you an extract for what passes as public relations in the UK government. This is hot from the press, as they say. Journalist. The deputy chairman of the Conservative Party said that people that wanted to protest the monarchy should leave the country. Does the Prime Minister agree with that? Rishi Sunak's press secretary. It's not something that the Prime Minister has expressed. Journalist. In which case, does the Prime Minister think that people who don't support the right to protest should leave the Conservative Party? No, I think all members of the Conservative Party believe in the right to protest, as the Prime Minister has said on multiple occasions. But there needs to be a balance between that and ensuring that the lives of the majority are not seriously disrupted. Journalist. Lee Anderson doesn't agree with that, does he? He said they should leave the country. I think he's probably taking certain comments that he's made. I think that's probably taking certain comments he's made out of context. Journalist, what's the context? I haven't seen the comments, so it's not for me to comment on that. Journalist, so you're saying it's out of context, but you haven't seen the comments, and how do you know it's out of context? Well, I'm going to have to get back to you on that. You couldn't make it up. You know, it sounds like a script from one of the television shows. Look, tonight we are talking about the media and about other related topics with special guest Laura Webster, who's the editor of The National. And now, as you know, the TNT show is free and it's live, so no license, no problem. I will be taking your questions live. So if you want to ask Laura a question, the details will be posted on the screen. Now, to our special guest tonight. Hello, Laura. Thanks for joining us. How are you?
Hi, I'm good, John. Thank you very much for having me. Really enjoyed hearing that readout from Rishi Sunak's press secretary. I mean, that sums up what we deal with the UK government on a day-to-day basis.
Yes, you've taken me out of context. What's the context? I don't know the context. I haven't read it.
Yeah,
it's a classic. It's a classic. So a lot of people joining us tonight won't know very much about journalism. So could you describe a typical day for us? I mean, what time you get up, when you get into the office, how long you spend there, and when you manage to leave and go back home again? What's a typical day for you like?
Of course. So in journalism, we very rarely have a typical day. So it's always very different day to day. Monday to Friday can be completely different because you're working on different stories, you've got different projects going on, and you're having various meetings. And so every day is pretty different, often quite hectic and chaotic, but I'll try and give you a broad picture of what it's like. So let's start with a Monday. So perhaps on a Monday morning, I wake up about 7. First thing I do is I read through all of the news that's come in overnight. That includes stuff on social media, check in on, Good Morning Scotland, see if the UK government or the Scottish Conservatives have bothered to put anybody up for any questioning. And then I'll head into the office maybe around 9 o'clock and I'll start to see journalists popping up and we'll start to discuss what are the big issues that we need to deal with on that day. We have an official kind of conference around 11 a.m. where I'll kind of express what I think are the big things that we need to push. So let's take Monday morning for an example. A lot of people were talking about Keir Starmer and Labour's refusal to repeal the public order bill. This is a really big topic, and it wasn't really getting that much coverage south of the border. I really do feel like Labour are getting a pretty easy time in the media at the moment, but maybe that's a separate issue I can talk about later. So we really felt that we wanted to highlight this because obviously people were rightfully outraged by what happened over Coronation Weekend with Republican protesters and Just Stop Oil protesters being arrested before they had even began protesting. So it's pretty terrible for Labour, who are supposed to be the opposition, to be going along with that, refusing to repeal it. So we're talking about who can we speak to in Scottish Labour that we think would have a different opinion and might have something to say about that. Who can we speak to within the independence movement who can sort of draw the line between the problems with Labour and how they're the same as the Conservatives in many ways. And then that would just be like one conversation that we have. We discussed doing a piece of video with Professor Richard Murphy, and we put that together and put that out on TikTok and Instagram and everything. So it's nice and shareable and clippable for the younger generation who aren't going to pick up the paper in the same way. And we'll probably discuss various stories and plans for around half an hour, and then I'll send them all away and then send certain people to press conferences or out on a job, out to speak to people. We've got a journalist based in Westminster now permanently as well. So check in with him and see what's going on in that awful place. And then the rest of the day is really spent just keeping on top of everything, deciding what are the most important stories, how we package them for online. That's obviously a very important thing as well, because everything is digital first with the National. Obviously, we have a newspaper, but the website and what comes in our socials comes first, because there's such huge reach online that you aren't going to get with a physical printed paper. And so throughout the day, we're deciding on what goes out on socials, how we're going to present it, what we can turn into a TikTok, what we can make an Instagram graphic out of. At the same time, I'm having conversations with the people who are working on the production side to say, okay, on the front page, I think this is a really important story that we want to splash on. Or I've got this great op-ed coming from somebody, and I would really like it to get a good showing in the front of the paper. And by the time that's all dealt with, sometimes I'm finishing at 7, sometimes it's 8, and then on nights when it's really busy and you have parliamentary votes, sometimes I'm getting out of the office at 10, 11 o'clock. I know during the SNP leadership contest, there was a lot of like 14-hour days that were just soul crushing, and I'm very, very pleased that that's done with now. But yeah, that's basically a typical day. It's just a lot of liaising and coordinating and making sure everybody's kind of on the same page and knows what's going on, which can be very difficult in an era of home working and flexible working.
Yeah. So, I mean, I guess for you, it's a 6-day week.
Yeah, pretty much. Normally I get one weekend day off, but even still, there's a lot of independence events going on Saturdays and Sundays that I would like to be involved with. And I think it's really important as the editor of The National to make sure that you're engaged and know what's happening. So, for example, on Saturday, I was at the All Under One Banner March and Rally. And even though I was technically off, I was still live streaming stuff to our Facebook page, because I feel like, well, I'm here, I may as well do it. And I'm sure people are interested to hear what people like Joanna Cherry and Tasmina have to say. So, yeah. And then a few weeks ago, I was at a conference with the Young Scots for Independence, and they had invited over people from all across Europe who are basically future MEPs, future representatives in their country, with the idea of getting them to understand why Scotland wants independence and to learn more about the movement. And that was really great to meet with them, because they are future leaders in their countries. And, you know, they had a lot of understanding and sympathy for Scotland's situation. So I love to do these kinds of things. Obviously, having a social life alongside that can be quite challenging sometimes, but I manage.
Well, we've got 2 questions for you right away. First one is technical. Charles is asking, my online version's download time slows down later in the day and it's very slow in the evening. Is there a reason for this, or possibly a problem at my end?
That's a very interesting question. It's not something I've heard of happening before. However, I do know just anecdotally that our traffic would be higher later in the day and in the evening. Our peak times are normally between 5 and 7 p.m. So you might often see that we have saved a really big exclusive or a good interview to go live at that time of day. And that tends to see our web traffic goes up and up and up throughout the day.
Yeah.
So that is possibly why that's happening, but I can't rule out that it's some kind of technical gremlin at your end as well.
Okay, well, a bit of praise before we go to the next one. Geronimo says, I think you're great, Laura. I love the paper. Great work by you and your team. Keep up the great work.
Thank you.
On the other hand, John McGroarty says, why are you deplatforming Alba?
I hear this a lot at the moment, and it's very unfortunate that this seems to be the reception that we're getting, because we are not deplatforming Alba. I've had meetings with Alba representatives in the past week or so. You know, we've done stories on Alba policies, stuff that Kenny McCaskill is doing, stuff that Neil Hamby is doing towards the industrial problems that are going on to do with the military base in his constituency. We had an op-ed from Neil Hamby on Saturday as well. We've reported extensively on Alex Salmond around the coronation and things. So I do hear this a lot, but I think sometimes maybe people's perception of the paper isn't like you're not getting the full picture of what's kind of going on, because maybe you see something on Twitter that you don't necessarily like, or a headline that you don't agree with, rather than the full kind of picture of what's on the website. And you know, I hear from the SNP, oh, you write too much about Alba, and I hear from the Greens, you write too much about the SNP, and I hear from Alba, you write too much about the SNP, not enough about us. So because the movement is quite divided, I think it's quite natural for people to feel that maybe their party or their organization isn't getting fair coverage. But you know, as a newsroom, we do make a really big effort to make sure that all parts of the independence movement are included and covered. So you know, if you have those feelings, please do write to me, and I can chat to you and about how we can resolve that, because I don't want anybody in the independence movement to be excluded from the national. The point is that it's for everyone in the movement.
Well, if it's any consolation, I remember once interviewing Andrew Marr when he was the editor, I think, of The Independent. We had lunch in London many years ago, and he said, I get criticised from the right and from the left, so I figure I'll probably get it just about right overall.
Yeah.
So he said if it was all coming from one direction or the other, he said it would be, I'd be worried, but he says it's right across the board. And the Independent is still going fairly strong, I imagine. But you mentioned earlier about the importance of social media. And I mean, it seems to me that's an absolutely essential point, because when you look at the way young people access information, it's not the way older people do. I mean, older people will pick up a copy of an actual physical newspaper, by and large, and feel hugely comforted just by that action. They regard that as news. If you ask anyone younger, they say, well, that's just old-fashioned. You know, I get my news instantly, and it changes instantly. And your newspaper can't, that piece of paper, that piece of crushed wood with ink impregnated on it, can't change quickly. I'm used to instant stuff. And you mentioned, I think we were on recently on TikTok because we're trying to extend our reach. But I guess from a media point of view, it's just really essential for you to be on social media.
100%. I mean, I was saying to you earlier that sometimes we're talking about what's kind of social presentation we're going to give a story before it even has a picture and a headline attached, because it's so important to sell the story well on social media. And especially with things like TikTok now, the reach that you can get is just unbelievable. I mean, our TikToks on regular occasions have had nearly 1 million views, and obviously we don't sell 1 million copies of the paper every day. So yeah, you can imagine that the reach that we can get on there is just so significant. There's a lot of young people who are just kind of consuming their news through quick videos on TikTok, quick videos on Instagram Reels.
Yeah.
Obviously, I am fairly young, and so I talk to my own friends and family about how they kind of consume news content. And a significant number of the ones who are under 30 really don't have a brand that they are loyal to. They don't say, oh, I go and I read The Guardian, or I go and read BBC News. They just go on their social media and they see what they see. So if you can make a story really pop on something like Twitter or TikTok or Instagram, then that's how you reach your audience, and they naturally share it. And they are kind of doing the advertising for you in a sense, because they're putting it on their Instagram story, or they're reposting it to their Twitter. They're quote tweeting it because they have something funny that they want to say on top of it. They have an opinion that they want to share. So social media is kind of magic for us in a way, in getting that reach out there and spreading the independence message, and making sure that we can kind of cut through a lot of the unionist noise on there. I would say it's very challenging as Scotland's only pro-independence daily paper in a lot of ways, right? But at the same time, I think that we're kind of streets ahead of a lot of our media competitors in terms of how we deal with social media, how we deal with multimedia. And so regularly after big events, you'll see that our reporters are putting out videos. You know, they've been speaking to Hamza Yusuf after FMQs, and they've captioned it up and it's ready to be shared. And our competitors really don't have that going on. And so that does give us a bit of a leg up. And I think it's just because we're a young paper, we have quite a young team as well, that we have that advantage over people who maybe feel they have to do things in a particular way because they've been in the industry for such a long time. But of course, there are older people who do fantastic things in Scotland's media as well. And I don't want to come across like I'm being ageist about it or anything like that.
No, you should be ageist. No, I'm not suggesting you are ageist, but my sense of the political process, and maybe I'm in a better position than you are to make this comment, is it is old. You know, my sense of it is it's old. No disrespect to anyone involved in politics, but when I look at the people on screen and I listen to what they have to say, they very often resort to cliche, which, you know, I think can be very off-putting, because a lot of these cliches stem from what they learned at school. And what's happening in school right now is very different to those cliches, perhaps. You know, incidentally, when you use social media, is there a revenue stream associated with that? Do you get paid per click or some such thing? Is that the way it works?
No, not really. I mean, for us, it's just a way to really drive people onto the website and drive people ultimately, hopefully, down the line to then wanting to take out a subscription and wanting to be involved in the independence movement. Like on YouTube, for example, we do get some ad revenue, but it's not very much. YouTube is not the place to be making big money. Things like TikTok, although you get a huge reach, there's really not very much monetization potential with it. That we haven't really figured that out yet. Same with Facebook. In fact, if you want to really push posts on Facebook, you have to give them money rather than the other way around. Exactly. So it's not so much a money maker as it is very good for brand awareness, and just very good for reaching those audiences who I think the independence movement and campaign have had challenges reaching in the past.
Yeah, I mean, it is. Charles is asking, did I hear that you had or perhaps are considering a podcast?
Yes, so we have our one podcast at the moment that is with Abby Garton-Crosby and Steph Braun. They do the Hollywood Weekly podcast, which you can get on Spotify and I think all your other kind of normal streaming places on a Friday. And that is really just about Scottish politics over the last week. So it comes out every Friday, and they do various interviews with people. So they interviewed all of the SNP leadership candidates. This week, they sat down for half an hour with the new Minister for Independence, Jamie Hepburn, and they discussed what his plans are, how he feels about various bits of Westminster legislation that have gone through, and Westminster plans, like this ridiculous thing about stopping Scottish ministers from meeting up with other governments abroad. They discussed all of that. So you're able to listen to that on a Friday. The thing I've heard that people really like about the podcast is sometimes they don't have time to physically sit down and scroll through and be like, okay, I'm interested in this story. In the podcast, it's about 40 minutes and you can sit and listen to it, and you kind of, I don't know, you can do your ironing or your hoovering at the same time and just soak up that information, which I think is really useful. And we were really hoping to do another couple of podcasts too, since that one's been really successful. And I was hoping to start one that's really just about building a country. So it would have various experts on different topics, and each week we would take a different topic, whether it's the health service, general public services, something like the Constitution. You know, you can come chat to us about that.
Happy to do that.
Yeah, exactly. So every week we would just discuss how we would build the country according to that person. Now, it doesn't have to be the Bible for how an independent Scotland would look, but it would just take views from various kind of stakeholders in the movement on how we would do things. And I think that would be quite an interesting one for the readers to listen to. And it would also give us an opportunity to really push how an independent Scotland would look and what we would do in an independent Scotland, rather than the conversation being about how do we get there, all of this kind of constitutional wrangling that really, really bores people a lot of the time and puts people off. And this way we would actually get to kind of share a positive message. So hoping to start that one soon, and there may be some other ones in the pipeline as well.
Oh, that sounds good. I mean, that sounds very good, in fact. And the other thing too is I was watching some stats today, the latest opinion polls, and they're suggesting that, that what seems to have been a pattern for the last goodness knows how many months, stroke years, is that the two sides are 50-50, roughly 48, 52, 52, 40. But when you look at the stats for those who weren't able to vote in 2014, it's dramatically different.
Yeah.
It's very suggestive of the fact that that audience has been completely won over, or mostly won over, by the Yes campaign. Even without necessarily being in contact with the Yes campaign. It must be something to do with age, I suspect, or a sense of maybe, and maybe this is stretching it a little bit, maybe the sense of a feeling of a democratic deficit, not necessarily in terms of Scotland's constitutional place, but maybe an overall feeling that government doesn't listen. And the easiest way of addressing that is to say, well, let's not just change the government, because that's not going to change a great deal. What you do need to do is to change the form of the state to make it responsive to people like me. And I think maybe that's what people are asking for. It's not so much Labour, Tory, SNP, but responsiveness. I mean, all you've talked about tonight is responsiveness.
Yeah, 100%. And, I think for people of my generation and younger, perhaps, who weren't able to vote, and you've grown up in an era where there's been 10 years plus of conservative austerity, and you've seen your public services decimated. Maybe Scotland has better ones, but at the same time, the general headline is the NHS, and for example, is not in a great place, could be in a better place. You've seen your freedom of movement lost. You've found it harder than ever to get on the housing ladder. All of these very basic things that people have grown up expecting to be able to get because that's what their parents were able to get have been taken from them. And so how do you expect the UK government to take care of you for the rest of your life if they haven't been able to set you up for being in your 20s, being in your 30s, and having the life that you would expect anybody to have? It's very difficult for young people now. And as someone being in Scotland who is very grateful to get my free tuition fees, I have cousins in England who are looking at that and saying, oh, why can't we have that? So it's clear that for young people, the Scottish government and Scotland in general has been able to provide things that the UK government hasn't been able to provide. And what's more, looking into the future, they're not wanting to live in that kind of state where we have migrants living on a big barge off the coast of Cornwall and things like that. So there's all kinds of reasons, I think, that push people towards independence, even if they haven't necessarily engaged with the Yes campaign or they weren't really engaged in 2014. And it's only going to continue because the UK government doesn't care about anybody, but it especially doesn't care about young people.
Yeah, and I think the point you made about young people being concerned that students in Scotland, might even be family and friends, are getting free education and they have to pay a fee. And the likelihood is the fee will increase because it's everyone's experience that taxes start off small but don't stay small. I think the first income tax was around about 3 or 4%. Compare that with now. So people are looking at those numbers and thinking, gracious, all these people in Scotland are off to a racing start. When I get a job, I'm going to have to spend a chunk of it not thinking about buying a property, even getting a decent property to rent, but just think seriously about how to repay this debt.
Hmm.
And that I think that leads to cynicism too, perhaps, because they will think back to the last coalition, because it sounds like we might be heading for another coalition, perhaps, with where the Lib Dems got into bed with the Tories, and the very first thing they did, just about, was to abandon their commitment to free education
Hmm.
and then introduce tuition fees. So I think when particularly young people look at that, they think, gracious, would you really want to be in the control of people like that, whose word you just cannot depend upon? And it's easy for people to become cynical in that environment. Uh, uh,
100%.
Would you agree?
Yeah, 100%. And plus, if you look at the opposition, what are they offering? Nothing. Like Labour have abandoned their tuition fees, free tuition fees pledge. I don't know how many of Keir Starmer's 10 pledges are actually still active, because he's abandoned his pledge to nationalise the railways, to nationalise the Royal Mail, nationalise water, despite all of the problems with water in England and the
Yeah.
state of the waterways. He's abandoned so many things that he promised. And it looks like you're going to just get the Tories or you're going to get the red Tories. And that's not a particularly inspiring thought for young people who can look across to Europe and see what kind of lives young people there have. And many of them are significantly happier, significantly healthier, and significantly better and richer.
Yeah, and richer too. Yeah, I mean that's the terrible irony. I think one of the reasons that the government isn't even more unpopular is the fact that people get seldom to hear about what's happening elsewhere. I think if people really knew what was happening in countries like France and Spain, Portugal, dare I say it, a very small country, it seems to be able to look after its people exceptionally better than Westminster. So it's not as if there isn't sufficient funds around to address these concerns. That the money is there. They
Yeah.
can print it. We all know they can print it, because when there's a crisis or a war, there's no shortage of money. So clearly, it's not a question of, we're broke, I mean, I think so many people in the independence movement have demolished that argument that a state budget is like a domestic budget. It just ain't.
Yeah, it's not true.
It's categorically untrue. But that has left a lasting impression. I still hear ministers talk about, well, we can't afford it.
Mhm.
You must
Yeah.
hear that every day.
Yeah, it's very frustrating. I mean, I'll use my own family as an example. My parents are from the northeast of England and probably quite traditional Labour voting people of that kind of area. Most of my family is. And they, hated Thatcher. Family lived on colliery and things like that. So they're not naturally conservative in any way, but the way that they view economics is still through this prism of sort of Thatcherism and neoliberalism, where everything has to be accounted for and paid for, and there has to be kind of money left over, just like you would have a household budget. And I try and explain that it's not necessarily like that, but when you've lived through decades of the media telling you that that's how the economy works, then it's quite hard to overcome that. And I would add to say that if my parents lived in Scotland, I think they would both vote yes now, and my mom has definitely said that she would. So we'll have to try and encourage them back here.
But you're right. I mean, there's a whole bunch of stuff goes on there that I mean, part of it must be down to the education system. I mean, the fact that these issues have never been addressed since the day that Thatcher produced that myth. I mean, the two things she said that never made any sense. One was it's just like a household budget, was categorically untrue. And secondly, there's no such thing as society. I think she backtracked on both of those later. But nonetheless, the very fact that somebody could say there is no such thing as society is deeply troublesome, it seems to me, because we're social animals. I mean, everywhere I go, the best of people are those who cooperate and work together to achieve things. So it's not a political point; it's more a societal point. As we're social animals, we tend to work best when we get together and cooperate. And maybe the worst of us comes out when we don't cooperate.
Yeah, of course. And I mean, Thatcher wasn't running a government by herself. She had a whole cabinet of people around her who she was working with. So her own statement made no sense.
Yeah, but got tremendous currency in the media because obviously it suited the agenda at the time. But now we've got a different agenda, which is all about preventing immigrants or asylum seekers landing on these shores. And many people, when they look at that, I've got some very good friends, and they are not necessarily independence supporters. They may be independence light at a maximum, but they're very open to some sort of framework where everyone across these islands is all part of some sort of connected activity of some kind, even though they may be sovereign states. They are distressed by this. They're distressed by it because they didn't grow up with these values. They grew up with a different set of values, which are about if somebody's in trouble, you try and help them. What you don't do is strike them when they ask for your help. Now, they're not bleeding hearts, these folks. They're not people saying, look, the whole world should come here and we shouldn't give a damn what their backgrounds are. They're not saying that. What they're saying is, it's just a part of the social condition that you actually try and help where you can. And they're very distressed by what they see. Do you find that also with your family and friends, as well as colleagues, as well as colleagues in the same industry, as it were?
Yes, certainly. I mean, in terms of how far to the right the Conservatives have gone, I mean, that was clearly a strategic decision to try and wipe out the likes of UKIP and the Brexit Party. And, they've done that pretty successfully at the cost of needing to have these very extreme policies, the Rwanda plan and the terrible illegal migration bill, which is just disturbing. What's even more disturbing is Labour saying they won't repeal it. But anyway, a lot of people voted Conservative in previous years who aren't necessarily far right at all. They're people who just have a conservative ideology and want to make sure that they have enough money in their pocket. Really, like they believe they're doing the right thing. They're not attracted to these kind of extreme far right ideals. And so the Conservatives, in reaching out to the far right in England, have really actually alienated a large part of their own base. So those people in the southeast of England who are now voting for the Lib Dems instead, they're certainly not getting excited about the prospect of sending migrants away to Rwanda, and that's certainly not motivating them to vote. I mean, it causes headlines and it makes it seem like they're winning the culture war, but in reality, it's getting a minority of people all hyped up about something, putting the lives of refugees who are already in perilous situations in further danger, horrible protests outside hotels and things like that. I mean, it's despicable. And I do think it's very off-putting. And as I say, Labour's sort of soft stance on all of this horribleness is only going to put more people off Labour as well. Just anecdotally from speaking to friends and families in England, again, they are really concerned by Starmer's lack of opposition to things like the illegal migration bill, and they see that there's less choice for them. There's obviously the Greens, but the Greens aren't really an electoral force in England in the same way that they are in Scotland, and that's largely down to first past the post being a terrible system. So a lot of people, I feel, at the next election, for reasons like this, are probably not going to vote.
Well, that's very sad, because what happens if people don't vote is they allow the extremes to have greater control. But I agree with you. I mean, if I was a voter in England and I'm looking at the rather unappealing choice that's been put to me, which is that I can vote for the Conservatives, whom many people find increasingly repellent, because, as you say, they've gone further and further to the right. But at the same time, they look at the Labour Party and they think, oh, where's the choice? I was hoping for a choice.
Exactly.
In fairness to Labour, we've interviewed a number of people on the show, and they've said to us, actually, behind the scenes, Labour supporters will tell you, we don't believe in any of this crap.
Yes, I hear the same thing, yeah.
And we have to say it. Otherwise, we'll lose the votes of people who are against immigration. We'll lose the votes of people who are against strikers, and we'll lose the votes of people who don't want public servants to get a decent increase, because in their view, public servants are not like people in private industry who have to compete and have really tough jobs, etc. And I mean, I just find that argument baseless, frankly, because I think if you go into a discussion with somebody and you hide your true intentions, one of two things happens. Maybe both happen. One is you get found out because somebody somewhere will ask that question. You used to believe in this, now you believe in that. Can you tell me what happened in between? And which of these should I now believe? And the other issue is that you corrupt your own supporters. Now, these are the people you need to go around knocking on doors and saying to people, look, please consider voting and changing things. Or you just simply produce that sense across the broad mass of the electorate, which is to say, what's the point in voting for any of them?
Yeah, 100%. You can't trick people into voting for you. And if they do successfully, let's say, win a majority on the idea of not repealing public order bill, not repealing illegal migration bill, are we then to believe that suddenly they're to change their mind and to actually repeal all those things? Because that would probably upset a lot of the people who they told they wouldn't do those things to. And that would almost certainly get them sent out of government pretty quickly. Oh, my battery's running low. Give me 2 seconds. I need to plug it in, but I'm still here.
No worries. Take your time. Take your time. The best laid schemes of mice and men.
I don't know how it happened. It seems to be plugged in. Oh, not fully.
Yeah.
There we go.
What happens to mine is I use it now. What I do is I leave the darn thing plugged in all the time now. But that's no good if you're traveling around. You know, I have this phone, you know. And every time I go to use it, I discover I've left the damn thing unused for a couple of months, and it just sits there and looks at me as if to say, yes, well, what do you want now? You've neglected me for all these weeks, and now you say you want to do something. You know.
Typical.
Jock Gibson is asking, will the National be covering the event in Kilmarnock on the 27th of May? And I'm not sure what the event is, but he goes on later to say there are free Palestine events this weekend in Scotland.
I didn't know about that event either, but if you get in touch with me, Jock, I would be very happy to send a reporter. We've always been quite big on covering issues to do with Palestine and standing up for the Palestinian people. So yeah, send it my direction and I will see what I can do.
There you are, Jock. Now, picture the scene, if you can, and I'm sure you'll find it difficult. Imagine the scene if this was not Laura and it was the head of the BBC, and I asked that question. Can you imagine you would get such a candid response? Never in a million years. You would get corporate speak. You would get, oh, well, we generally do that. Of course, I'd have to check, but it seems to me that in the fullness of time, we've given all parties equal, you know, we'd have gotten that. I used to write this stuff, by the way, so I can say with some conviction. And it's all the way avoiding answering the question, which is the very opposite, with the greatest respect, what you just did.
Oh, thank you.
Well, no, this is a serious point. This is it. That's the difference. And I think the reason people are warming to what you're saying is because it's so different. You know, you get asked a question, and instead of this ducking and diving and fooling around and saying, well, maybe you know, maybe yes, but no, you actually came back with what sounded to me like a very straightforward answer. So there you are, Jock. You've had your answer. You wouldn't get that on the BBC. You wouldn't get it on ITV. And here you are. Fantastic. Good luck to you. Anyway, by the way, I'm not making any comment on the particular subject, though. What's important is that, because it seems to me this is probably where we're heading as far as the media is concerned, perhaps. You know, that the focus on immediacy will probably intensify. You know, it's just the nature of the world we live in now. We've now got AI, which can make up whole books if it wants. So the only thing that's going to, I expect, run counter to that is this candid immediacy.
Yeah.
Maybe that should be a slogan for the National.
Yeah, I like that. That's good.
and we have immediacy, but you know that's clumsy. But you know, seriously, I think that's going to be the key to the future. I expect, How you pull that off as a media entity on a significant scale is an interesting point, but it seems to me that's the way we're headed. People just aren't interested anymore. I think they're interested in thought pieces, that help them get behind the news, as it were. I think there'll always be a demand for that, but I'm not sure it's a substantial demand. I think it's maybe more of a niche market. Whereas immediacy, I think, will be the vast part of the market in the future. Does that sound right to you?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, people really want. It's interesting how kind of low the bar is that me just responding honestly to a commenter is worthy of praise, I guess, because it just goes to show how far removed a lot of the media is from its readership. And the whole point of the National is that we're there for the independence movement, and so I do try and talk to people in the independence movement every day, and I try and give them insight into how we work as a newsroom, how we make decisions. On a weekly basis now, I'm sending out this behind the headlines newsletter to people who want to receive it. So you can subscribe to it online. It's totally free. And it just gives you a bit of insight into what we've been doing in the newsroom, how we've, covered certain stories, what the behind the scenes were at Holyrood that week, and all this kind of stuff, because there's no reason why people shouldn't know about how things actually work. And I think a lot of the media likes to have this kind of smokescreen and make it seem like this very glamorous thing. It's very normal. You're just people in a room talking to each other, answering questions. People didn't have insight into that. And last week, when we did a front page that people had quite liked, it was the one with the very bleak background and the sort of torn Union flags along the Mall in London. So I put together a very quick TikTok just showing how I came up with it and who I worked with on the graphics. And yeah, I think people like that kind of insight and kind of quick understanding of what goes on in the media. And yeah, I mean, I have no problem showing it. The National exists because people support us, so you deserve to know what happens in the newsroom.
Yeah, and I think we talked offline about, well, certainly I find the general approach of the media in Scotland to be a bit odd. I mean, I've said this in my columns, I'm not saying anything now that I didn't say then, which is that we have a situation which, even if you take it at its most unspecific, in the constitutional debate, where it's roughly 50-50, depending on when you measure it and stuff like that, and precisely how you ask the question. And yet the media, apart from the National and the Sunday National, is almost exclusively unionist. And, I think as a marketing person, I'm thinking, that seems very odd to me, because if there is constitutional change, the National and the Sunday National will be way out there, because all of a sudden they become hugely attractive to advertisers.
Yeah.
And it's just the way that business works.
Mm.
They may not be all over you like a cheap suit just now, but if it were ever to change, you'd have to beat them off with sticks, I suspect, because advertisers will say, look, we have to shift our baked beans. It doesn't do any good to sell baked beans in Ireland with a non-Irish accent on television. It's all that the soundtrack is changed to accommodate Irish sensitivities. It would be the same in Scotland. Mm. The BBC wouldn't be able to exist in its present form, and neither, by the way, would STV. Just by the very nature of what constitutes a national conversation, it's just the way things are. And anyone who doubts it only has to look at other countries where you find the national conversation takes prominence, and then there's bits around the edges like foreign correspondence and stuff like that. But it's a very different outlook and a different mentality to what exists in Scotland, where it's the other way around. Mm. And I think a lot of people might find that somewhat confusing. But I've always found it odd that the media wasn't trying to at least soften some of its very hard edges, because we are entering a period of very hard unionism, I suspect. And I think that's unfortunate, because every action tends to have an equal and opposite reaction. Oh, a question again from Charles. Charles, you're doing well tonight. That's your third question, but it's a very good one. He's asking, have you ever been invited on to debate night? Any questions?
No, I haven't been invited onto debate night. I also haven't been invited onto question time. I've been invited onto news night, and I think it was actually in London. And on that day, I was in Glasgow, so I was like, I'm not going to London just for like 15 minutes on news night. But yeah, I do get invited onto some BBC things. A lot of the time, because of my work is very demanding, I genuinely just don't have the time to do it, and so they have been very understanding and very accommodating about that, and have been able to take somebody else from the national. For example, like our chief political correspondent or somebody who are obviously fantastic and cover this stuff day in, day out.
Yeah.
So they're top experts. But no, never invited onto debate night or question time. Interesting. Never thought about that.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think everyone appreciates how much ad hocery there is in the broadcast media. I mean, I once did a piece on the moral maze, which oddly enough included a whole bunch of people that I didn't think were terribly moral, but and I happened to be traveling at the time. I think I was crossing the Kincardine Bridge, and this researcher called me and said, "Can you get to London and do the moral maze, please?" And I said, "Don't you have anyone else closer to central London?" "No, we don't have anyone. It has to be you." And of course, once you get there, you realise that everyone else has said no.
That's what happened the day that I got invited onto news night. Yeah.
So I spent a happy 15 minutes talking to Michael Portillo and others about ethics and politics. We ended up not agreeing, as you might imagine. But yeah. The other thing I remember waiting in the hospitality room, that the other person who was waiting to go on a different show said to me, "I have to get out of here." I thought it was my aftershave. She said, "No, I've just seen a mouse." And she's like, "I can't be in this little room with mice."
Oh God.
We were run with mice. I mean, it's just the most extraordinary business. Anyway, a little bit of background about how glamorous broadcasting may turn out not to be. So, if you were to look, serious point now, if you were to look, as Americans say, down the pike, down the road, 5 years from now, what would you say the shape of Scotland might be at that time?
I think it is a very difficult question to answer, because there's so many possible ways the next election could go. So right now, if I had to put money on it, and I'm not a betting person, so I'm not actually going to lose anything if I get it wrong, but I would suggest that it's going to be a hung parliament. And I think that there'll be a bit of a Lib Dem revival in the southeast, especially, which is something we've seen over by-elections over the last few years. I suspect that Labour and Lib Dems will have the numbers to have a coalition. Though I understand that SNP are quite interested in pushing this idea that they will be the kingmakers and they will be able to call for indirect two effectively. And I don't know if that's going to happen. I think they would have to maintain a lot of seats in Scotland that the polling doesn't necessarily suggest they are going to maintain. So if there is a Lib Dem and Labour coalition, I'd suggest that's probably the worst case scenario for the SNP and for the independence movement, because I'm not sure why Labour would have any motivation to even work with the SNP if they already have coalition partners. So I don't think that Scotland would really get anything out of that deal, sadly. And I don't think that Keir Starmer would really shift on a Section 30 order unless the SNP had some kind of power in some kind of cooperation agreement or something. Then the other option is, of course, there being an SNP and Labour agreement. I just think that's really difficult to pull off, just based on the way that the polling is right now in Scotland. Roughly 38% or so for the SNP at Westminster. It's not quite enough to maintain the amount of seats that they have right now. Of course, if we said that this is a de facto referendum, that result could be very, very different. A lot of people who swap between Labour and the SNP, not feeling particularly strongly either way, but maybe are pro-independence, would in fact vote SNP. And I think the SNP probably would maintain more seats in that kind of scenario. I've seen polling that suggests that they would maintain a lot more of their seats, but of course the MPs don't like the idea of having it as a de facto referendum, so I don't know if that's very likely to happen. Of course, Hamza Yusuf has planned to do these regional assemblies where the SNP members determine how they'll treat the next election, but that hasn't happened yet. When I spoke to Hamza before before he was elected, this was maybe 2 weeks before his election, he did say that it was something he wanted to get started with, like within the first few weeks, and he hasn't done it. I mean, I know there's been a lot going on in the SNP, but still, I don't know what the situation is. I'm hopefully gonna get to speak to him in a few weeks and kind of push him on that. Because he also had said that he wanted to restart the independence campaign, like a real grassroots independence campaign with people from business, from trade unions in the first few weeks as well. And that also hasn't happened. But again, I do understand that there has been a lot going on in the party and he's had all of these various roles. So, you know, I don't think that that's not going to happen. It's just not happening right now at this second. And we would need that to really push for independence if that is to be the plan. We need to have this campaign and we need to have something for the movement, which is very divided, to unite around. So how many of options have I given you just now for how the next election is going to go?
No, that's good going. By the way, when you're talking to Hamza, tell him he's got an open invitation to come on our show.
I will do that.
If he wants to talk to a broad group of independent supporters. Oh, and by the way, we have 5 to 10% unionists who in our audience typically. So
I'll let him know.
so he can talk right across the political spectrum.
That's fantastic.
Just a couple of thoughts. I mean, that's a terrific analysis. Thank you for that.
It was very long. I apologize.
No, it's okay. It's perfect. It makes a lot of sense. The one thing that's notable that's historically that's noticeable about the Labour Party, it's not like the Tories. The Labour Party members, by and large, are much more driven by principle than pragmatism. So in other words, unless you're Tony Blair and you get a huge majority, in which case you can say to your dissident members, go forth and multiply because I'm going to steer the ship my way. The Labour Party, generally speaking, tends to have factions which don't get on.
Yeah.
So the notion of having a united Labour government for a protracted period of time would be, leaving aside Tony Blair's experience, would be very odd in the basis of Labour's record. So there you do get all sorts of strange things happen, where the factions find the leadership so upsetting that they're prepared to vote any old way in order, to demonstrate their disapproval. But you never can tell. I mean, I would expect Tories, particularly with a large majority, I would expect any Westminster party to ride roughshod over everybody. I mean, but as you say, that's unlikely to happen. And even if you get a Lib Dem Labour conjoined government, again, it tends to lend itself to factionalism, where all of these submerged things that we talked about earlier, let's pretend to be anti-immigrant in order to make sure we capture all those votes on the far right. All these things come into play once you're in government. The way the House of Commons works, you need to command that majority.
Yeah.
Because if you don't, you fall heir to all the ills caused by the divided system. And the SNP wouldn't need to vote with the Tories. They would just need to sort of abstain, for example, on some issue that Labour regarded as being hugely important, and then the government falls. But it falls of its own volition. I mean, there are all sorts of permutations out there which the first past the post system produces. Whereas if you had a sort of proportional system, the likelihood is that people would join it and say, look, I know on what basis I'm combining here. I agree with this and not with that. And it's open for everybody. There are distinct parties that do that because of the way Westminster is organised. You have to try and compress all of that into two big parties. And I think we're reaching the end of that phase. I'm not sure it quite works the same way anymore.
I would like to think that. I mean, I hope that even when independence happens, England can have proportional representation, because I don't think they deserve to be stuck with that horrible system forever. But there's just so many ways that the next election could potentially go that I think really Scotland's future does kind of hang in that balance. I mean, this next election is so important. I don't think anybody wants to see the Conservatives remain in power for a second longer than they have to. They have done nothing but destroy what was left of the UK over the last 13 years. And I really genuinely cannot take a positive policy from their time in government. And that's really not just me being anti-conservative, that's me looking at the whole picture and looking at the economic situation and just saying, okay, this is pretty terrible, because it is. And I think after the next election, what is most important is that the independence movement can unite, regardless of who is in charge, regardless of who is the leader, regardless of the factionalism that is in the independence movement, just like in Labour. They need to really unite around the cause, because there's so many attacks on Holyrood just day in, day out. You know, I'm working in the newsroom and every day there's something new. It's dealing with governments abroad, it's Section 35. Every day they are just finding new ways to attack Holyrood, and I really don't think that Labour would be inspired to give us any further devolution or to change the constitution significantly. So no matter what happens, the independence movement really has to stick together and make sure that we are on the same page.
I mean, you just touched upon an extremely serious point. It seems to me if there's a dispute and one person decides to remain largely mute and the other person becomes more and more vociferous, the argument tends to go by default. I mean, it often strikes me that the SNP government in particular is not nearly assertive enough. I mean, I see what happens, but I didn't understand the logic of having the First Minister surrounded by press people. It seems to me that if the First Minister is going to speak, it ought to take place in a much more formalised setting. You know, for example, the White House has its press room, and I know that it adds to the sort of immediacy of the thing if you're surrounded by newspaper people, but I just don't think it's appropriate, honestly, because it looks as if it's terribly defensive and you've been trapped. And I'm not sure that's a good look. And I also feel that one needs to be a great deal more assertive when it comes to media relations. I don't think it's appropriate just to sort of wait until the next attack comes along. I think there should be a whole bunch of issues on which the media is less certain of its footing. And I'm not talking about the National and the Sunday National, but by and large, I mean, as someone who used to handle media relations in a large corporation, it just looks supine to me. I just don't understand the logic of it. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe you see more of it than I have seen today.
I think a lot of the time there are people in the Scottish Government Press Office or SNP Press Office who just don't want to, as they see it, give more attention to things than are deserved. So if there is some kind of false claim made about, I don't know, let's say independence in general, let's just make it a very general point, and I maybe get in touch, or one of the reporters gets in touch and says, how are you responding to this? A lot of the time they might say, well, we're not going to, because we feel that if we respond to it, we're gonna, kind of pour fuel on the fire a little bit. I have a different take on that, because I think once something is out there, especially in this social media 24-hour news cycle kind of world, it's out there. And if you're not going to respond to it, it's just going to keep spiraling, and it's going to keep growing, and you have to respond to it. I understand that they don't want to damage themselves, but I do feel the same way. I think a lot of the time they probably could say something, and they probably could put the brakes on certain stories a bit quicker, but there's a bit of a caution there that, I don't think the Conservative press office or the Labour press office really have. And I think what we do with our fact checks is strong and it's good. At the same time, we don't have the resources of the whole Scottish government at our fingertips to fully fact check those kinds of things. And so it would be great if the SNP and or the Scottish government had some kind of fact check and rebuttal service, which I believe is something that the SNP have planned to do at some point, but hasn't actually happened. But yeah, for now, you'll just have to stick to reading national fact checks, John. Sorry.
Well, that's a terrific plug to end the show. No, I'm a great believer in advertising. I think it's crazy not to advertise. I think it's crazy not to be assertive, because I think nowadays, particularly nowadays, you need to be assertive. And this notion that if you just sit back there, it'll go away, forget it. Not going to happen. Anyway, we've run out of time. Thank you very much indeed, Laura. It's been great. We aim to be educational, informative, and entertaining, and you've helped us achieve all of that and more.
Oh, thank you. It's been great.
I'm terribly grateful. If you could hang around for a few seconds after we go off air, I would appreciate it. I'm just going to make a few concluding remarks, if I may, because it's been a great show. There's not much I can add to that. All I would say, please look out for my column in the Sunday National at the weekend. I'll be looking through a glass darkly at cruel Britannia. So join us next week when we'll be talking about an exciting new movie called To See Ourselves by Jane McAllister. It's an account of the 2014 referendum and much else, and shot in large part while Jane was pregnant. So she had all this sort of stuff going on in her personal life, and yet she devoted so much of it to help the rest of us understand ourselves, to see ourselves. Look out for that next week. And I do believe there's been some coverage in the National. There may well be some more if you look out for it. And also, please help us fight e-sickers, i.e. everything Scottish is crap, by supporting the National. And let me just add one point, and I'm not a terribly religious person, but I was struck by the Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby, today, who claims that the illegal migration bill is not only a breach of international law, he says it's also deeply immoral. He says international rules on the protection of refugees are not inconvenient obstructions to be got round by governments. And even if this bill were to stop the boats, which Welby says he does not think likely, it will not stop climate change or international conflict, which often give rise to people seeking a different life. The United Nations Commission on Human Rights has warned that this could lead to the collapse of the international system for protecting refugees. And Welby saying, is that what you want? Is that what we want as a country? He agrees that the UK cannot take all refugees, but the legislation ignores the need to address the problem of refugees. He goes on to say, it is isolationist, it is morally unacceptable, and politically impractical to let the poorest countries deal with the refugee crisis alone. I think I agree with most of that. Well, take care, stay safe, look after each other. Good night. See you next week. Take care.